One of them is Salim. He moved to Bulgaria a while ago from London, and he lives there now. He made it his home. And he's also the partner at Founder Centric and the founder of Lean Camp. And he's going to talk to you about how to master your craftsmanship.
Cool. Is there a clicker? Hey. Yeah. I just got off a plane and got in a mad taxi ride to get here. It was fun. Came from Wageningen in the Netherlands, where we did the Lean Camp, focused on food and agriculture. Lots of really cool tech. And there's something interesting going on there where we come from a pedigree, a world of technologists. And so we have this attitude to being very good at something. We have an attitude to being good at our craft, which can be both a benefit, but also it can be a liability. And I want to talk a bit about that, because I think that when we look at the attitude to mastery of craft, I've started to see a pattern between that and people who truly change the world. Now, I come from a group of 4 tech founders. We've all launched our own tech startups. We're called Founder Centric, and now we focus on education. We focus on making every founder as good as they possibly can be. We want to raise the bar, and we want to make European founders the best in the world across the board. I personally have run 5 startups myself, and I also started Lean Camp 5 years ago, helping bring lean startup thinking to Europe. And so you'd think if I was going to talk about something Japanese, it would be Toyota, it would be lean. But actually, I want to start off by talking about sushi. Does anybody know this man, Jiro? He is known as one of the best sushi chefs in Japan. And to work for him is a huge, huge honor. And when you start, you'll go into an apprenticeship. And for 10 years, you will work on rice. Like this, just rice. But after that 10 years, you can progress onto eggs. But there's something there around wanting to get the craft as good as possible, produce the best thing we can. And with techies, we have the same thing. You know, we talk about architecture, we talk about elegance of code. We have the same attitude. But then you bring in the world of tech startups. And we have this sense that, from the lean startup world especially, that we can run experiments and that they'll just work. We'll run something for a week, and when the experiment fails, we'll be like, hey, nobody cares about my idea. We don't take the time to upskill. Right? We have people who run really crappy landing pages like this. I have literally seen so many bad landing pages in my life. We've worked with more than 20 accelerators. We've taught thousands of founders. The number of times I've seen a button that actually didn't work and the founder decide that it was because nobody cared, it's bad information. We see this with Facebook campaigns, right? Like Facebook, you need to get good at Facebook advertising in order for it to tell you something about your business. We need to pick up the skill, and we're starting to lose sight of that. If you're going to climb a mountain, if you're going to take on this gargantuan task of launching a tech startup and changing the world, it's worth learning some skills in a safe environment. Now, I personally am inspired by a master educator called Michel Thomas. His attitude to education is that sometimes there are breakthroughs. Sometimes a student just really excels. Why is that the exception rather than the norm? And he realized that most of what we think about as good education is actually really, really similar to the prison system. And he wants to get rid of all those old tools and build a new type of education, a vision where everybody is learning really, really quickly. He's developed courses that routinely take students from their first words to conversational in a language in 3 days. And he does that by saying it's not the student's job to remember. It's not the student's job to learn. It's the educator's job to create the environment that creates the breakthroughs. So this is the crux of it. What I see is everyone has a vision of how they want to change the world, but we're letting ourselves be constrained. We're letting our visions themselves be constrained by the tools that we have now. And true masters don't accept that compromise. So drawing on Michel Thomas's work, I started to look at, well, how can we do this with customer development? When we talk about customer development, we talk about, I need to go and ask the right questions to my customer to learn if I'm on the right track. But we take the same approach to it, right? We go, well, the question I always get is, how many customers do I need to talk to before I know I'm on the right track? And people want to talk to 5 people, 10 people, and go, customer development, done. But we actually lose sight of the important thing. Everybody who teaches customer development, who knows about customer development, knows that it's not about what questions you ask. It's about how good a listener you are. Give yourself a little test. These are 3 of the most important signals you will be able to hear if you're good at customer development. Obstacles, goals, and actions that a customer takes. What happens in their life? How do they do it now? What goes on? If they're talking about their life and you do not hear 2 or 3 of those per minute, your listening skill probably isn't good enough for you to get the full benefit of having that conversation with the customer. And once you get really good, it will be more like 6 to 8 of these signals per minute. You'll start to really be sensitive to them and know which ones to dig into. And that's why they call it customer discovery. Because once you get good at it, you don't go with a preconceived notion of, am I right or wrong about this? You actually go to discover. There's something about this world that you don't know. And so you need to navigate the conversation and find out what it is. As we progress towards mastery, we get this sense of mastering our tools, right? Like a painter, they have as much dexterity at the tip of the finger as they do at the tip of the paintbrush. And we'll look at a great painter, Vermeer. Now, if you look at what he produced in the 17th century, I mean, this is very photorealistic. There are gradients here going on, there's lighting. And people who study this and who now know what we know about the human eye start to wonder, how did he produce a painting like that? Because he must have had a better eye than the regular human in order to be able to see that type of detail. And one of the leading theories is that he borrowed from the camera obscura. So he was looking at technology in a broad way. He was borrowing from one place and using it in another. He wasn't satisfied with the techniques that painters used at the time. He had a vision of something better, and he had to build the tools to make that happen. Does anybody know this band? Looks like a pretty typical 70s band. Anybody? Few, yeah? Anybody know them now? What about now? It's Kraftwerk. Pioneers of electronic music. But why were they pioneers? Let's go back to that first picture in 1971, but look at it from a different angle. These guys were hackers. Kraftwerk actually had to hack synthesizers together with keyboards to make the instruments that they needed in order to produce the music they wanted to produce. Again, not satisfied with the tools available, the contemporary tools. This is 40 years ago. And now, when we fast forward, we see that they've actually created an industry. But now you have all these tools to choose from. At the time, they didn't have that. When something is starting, the tools just aren't there. To be masters, we need to progress in our craft and get so good that we now create the tools we need. You know, in terms of visions of the world, we're all techies and we're all uncomfortable with this world of mass surveillance, right? And yet, what's our attitude to it? There's nothing we can do. But there is. There are tools that we're very familiar with. If you know how to install a program on your computer, you know how to encrypt your email. It's really that simple. It takes 10 minutes. We could all do it now. We could all, at Christmas, go home to our parents. And we could start to just create something, create the tipping point towards a vision that we all want to see happen, rather than just accept things the way they are. So why do we have this complacency? Right? I look at this from, like, this is Arch Linux. So I have now gone from Mac OS to Ubuntu, it's a baby step, it's quite similar, and then started to see the world of Arch Linux and started to learn how the Unix philosophy really helps you. Can you imagine talking to a pilot and him saying, like, how does the plane work? He's like, oh, that's the mechanical stuff. I don't care about that. That's not my job, right? I just put the thing on autopilot and land it. He'd be like, hey, yeah, can I please get into a 20-ton contraption going at 1,000 miles an hour and you drive it? Right? This is not somebody you'd trust to pilot you, certainly not somebody you'd think of as an innovator. And yet, as techies, as programmers, we constantly say that about the tools we use. I just want it to work. That doesn't matter. But when you start to get into this world, you start to realize that building your own OS, having that tight control and knowing all the different parts allows you to construct something that's better. You stop thinking, is there an app for this? And will I compromise? Which app will I choose? And you start just going, actually, I can pull together these parts and make something that makes me very, very efficient. You start to progress towards mastery. But it's an attitude shift. With the business model canvas, we see the same thing. This was designed to be built upon. This was designed to bring the wealth of design approaches to the strategy of business. Design methodology applied to business models. It was meant to be built upon. And when we work in accelerators, as educators, it's really tough to educate somebody who, like in an accelerator, think about this. Your job is to multiply the valuation of your company by 5 in 90 days. Now, if somebody says, hey, read this book, go to this course, do you have time? Right? You're so constrained for time. We didn't need the business model canvas to be a better way to communicate. We didn't need it to be a dashboard to show progress. What we needed was a way to manage all of the options that are being presented by the accelerator, and as a team, be able to see them all and choose between them. So again, mastery. You build the tool that you need, and this is what it looks like. Option cards. This is a great example. Granttree helps startups in the UK get government money. And you would, when you picture that, you'll probably imagine like a very boring office and people in suits and lots of paperwork. But when you look behind the scenes, this is Paulina, one of the founders, what they did is they took the approach that we have in tech startups to start to automate things, to write code, and they took that and made that part of their back end of their business. So now they're very, very efficient at helping startups do this. Again, they took from the camera obscura and they applied it to painting. And they progressed that whole industry. So here we have a typical DSLR, right? If you want to be a great photographer, now you choose your camera and then you learn it. Except for you will only produce pictures like everybody else with that DSLR. If we go back in time to the 20s, people had to make their own camera. You had a vision. What's the shot I want? What's the emotion I want to evoke? And then you would be such a good craftsman, such a good camera person that you would build a camera that got you that shot. And as the art form progressed, as the industry progressed into the moving picture, this is Citizen Kane. This is a shot that changed the entire film industry. For the first time, you'd have a dolly shot. It started outside, and as it pulled back into the room, everything stayed in focus. That was super hard to do with the technology at the time. It required aperture, lighting. It required getting the dolly right. All of it had to be coordinated. Never been done before. Greg Tolan, the cinematographer, pulled that off. And from then on, it set the new standard. That's what everybody did from then on. So we get into this mode where, as we progress in our art, it's not just our tools that extend us. In order to be true masters, to build a team around us, we have to get good at building and managing a team. Right? You find people that align with your vision, and you work together. That's a totally different thing to figure out. That's a new skill. And we see the same in the film art form, where before they used to be called the head actor. The director used to actually be the head actor to direct the other actors. So if you wanted to progress in your art, you would not only need to be a good actor yourself, but you would need to work through a set of actors. And now we have the idea of a film director. Again, you're controlling the apparatus of the entire team. It's extending you. This is the best management advice I ever got. You are responsible for your team's flow. So you progress from being good at your own art, from what you do and worrying about your own flow, to now having a team and worrying about if they're in flow or not. This extends to community again. You'll be familiar with Nelson Mandela and the story of apartheid in South Africa, but you might not know Steve Biko. Steve Biko was a philosopher. He grew up in a world where he was taught that the best thing he could be was a white person. And you think about growing up in that world and what it does to everybody. And he wrote a book called I Write What I Like. He started to think about how people could free their own minds. And he was the founder of the Black Consciousness Movement. He built a number of student organizations at first. Over his unfortunately short life, he built 3 separate organizations that helped spread that thinking. Again, unified in vision, but the community extended him. And we have this in startups, right? This is Lean Camp in Sofia, where you see a bunch of community leaders here, right? You see like there's Stan from Launch Hub, that's Andy from Product Hunt, and we're talking about option cards. We're sharing knowledge, right? We all have the same vision of what we want to create. And so we're working with other leaders. We're helping empower everybody. So we have this connection between open thinking and what hackers do. So let's start with a hacker you might be familiar with. What would you say is Linus's biggest art form that he contributed? It's the Linux operating system, right? But what were the tools that he used? He did something that nobody had done before. Every day he was releasing new versions of Linux, and thousands of developers around the world were contributing to this on a daily basis. Now, as he approached that, the source control tools of the time weren't good enough. The management techniques of the time weren't good enough. He didn't accept that. He created the tools and the management process that he needed to achieve the vision he wanted. And out of that came Git, which now we all pretty much use for source control. But that was a visionary not accepting the tools of the time and creating the tool he needed. You know, if you don't want to create a world-changing operating system, you might want to change a giant spider robot, which is what this guy did, Jamie Mansell. And he started by thinking, he lives in the woods. He's a bit of a, as someone who builds a spider robot, you'd think he's actually pretty crazy. And he lives in this tent in the woods. He started by thinking, well, I'm going to need to build a shed for the robot. For the shed, I'm going to need wood. I'm going to need to cut the wood. So the first thing I need to do is build a saw. And he ended up building this entire industry around him, off in the woods somewhere, and ended up building a giant spider robot and riding it around. By the way, you see the chains on his hands. The reason he does that is in case he's feeling tired or needs some extra power, he can just take the chains off. That's commitment. Sanjit Bhatia, a hacker scientist. Now, if you're a scientist, if you're a true researcher, especially someone like her who you're like researching to fight cancer, you're very frustrated. Because if you're lucky, what you've discovered today will benefit humanity in maybe a decade. So like a programmer who wants their work to benefit the world, you might think, well, I have to learn about user experience design. I have to learn to be a founder. I need to learn to get this to market. She went into clinics. And she started to realize one of the biggest problems with cancer detection. She built tools that weren't available yet. She developed a type of cancer detection where you drink some special yogurt, you take a shot, and you can detect cancer with a urine test. This brings cancer detection to parts of the world that can't afford it. Again, a visionary, didn't accept the tools, built them herself. Andy Young from Stripe. This is from his last startup, Group Spaces. When he helps founders, he recommends that you build your own data dashboards, that you learn SQL. This is the dashboard you start with. Why? Because you already have more data than any off-the-shelf analytics tool can collect about your users. And when you start to learn this, take care in the craft of data analytics, just learn a simple language like this. Now you can ask any question you want of your data. You're not constrained by what the analytics tools give you. So now I want to take it to the next level. I'm going to go over this really quickly, but I'll give you a way forward. Over 5 years of bringing Lean Startup to Europe and trying to teach people about it, I think we've gotten quite far, but we haven't achieved the real promise. When you think about the idea of the speed through the build, measure, learn loop, how come after 5 years we're not moving much more quickly? How come we're not adapting as much as that promise of Lean Startup? We're really fast at the build now, we're really good at the measure, but my experience is that we're still failing at the learn. We are not good at making decisions yet. And as a founder, I will put to you that if you do not master the skill of decision making, you're not going to progress. I've been collecting decision making tactics and tips from lots of great founders, serial founders who have serial successes. I'll cover a few of them here. So one is to use the data to ask questions, not to answer them. Packed coffee. This business is growing like crazy. Stephen Rappaport is at the helm, and he built another business, CrashPatter, which exited Airbnb. So this is his second success. He's constantly looking at his data. He's always looking at it to figure out what's going on here. Well, what don't I understand? In a subscription business, you really need to get your attention right. So he's constantly looking at data that gives him some unknown, some weird thing. Why is that happening? And he digs in and he answers it. And that's how he gets his retention rates super, super high. That's how he grows that business so quickly. He just raised $2 million as his first round. He's selling so much coffee that he has to vertical integrate already. Another one is just to inspect what's going on. Give you this problem. One day a customer wakes up, they grab their coffee, they log into a service, they've been using this for 2 weeks, they love it. Their free trial is over and they don't buy. Why? Anybody? What comes to mind? Sorry? Too expensive? There's no need? No buy button? Sorry, it's kind of... He's drinking coffee, yeah, he can't type. There's something we're doing here. We all naturally, given a bit of data, we jump to a conclusion. We fill in the blanks. We think we know what's going on. It's natural. But good founders fight this. They go, actually, there's something that's going on here that I need to understand. And so what I did helping this startup is I called up those customers on the day that they didn't buy. And I asked them, going, hey, what's going on today? Can you walk me through how you use the product? And what I realized was that all of them were ignoring the pop-up window because they were logging into their email. They were busy. They were trying to use the product. And so a pop-up window, get rid of that, X, go. Most didn't even remember seeing it. You need to inspect the situation. You need to realize what you don't understand and go and get that information. There's another thing about the biggest risk. Always tackle your biggest risk first. Well, the problem is that you don't really know what your biggest risk is. Gift Cannon, these guys started with, this is a great business model. You could send a gift to somebody over mobile, and then they could pick it up, something like a coffee or a beer, and they could pick it up at the local bar. Now, if you think about the biggest risk, you'll come up with lots of reasons why this won't work, and you'd probably end up doing customer development with a bunch of stores to figure out how they get customers and all this stuff, and it would take forever. What he did is he sent a bunch of people free beer, and he hung out in the bar and watched them come in. And from that, he learned exactly within a couple days exactly how to make that work. And then he went to the stores saying, I can turn one free beer into 15 pounds of revenue. The next week, he had a meeting with the CEO of the second biggest pub chain in the UK. Taken off. Not by focusing on his biggest risk, but by focusing on the fastest information. Because you don't know what your biggest risk is until you've actually kicked it out. And the last one is look where the data says yes. We always have experiments where we want them to say something. And when they say no, we're like, oh, and we move on. I wanted to try a membership thing with Lean Camp. And the only people who signed up were consultants. And I thought that was a failure because I wanted to build something for founders. What I didn't realize is that consultants were keen on this and I should work with them to help educate others. It took me a long time to get around to that. Don't be limited by the current tools or practices. Master your craft. If you found this useful, if you think that we can help unlock people's visions, please share this talk. I've written it up. If you're interested in more decision hacks, it's a free book. I'm working on it, so just sign up there. And my job is to go into ecosystems, find the weaknesses, build education that brings everybody up. So if I can help in any way, that's my email. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Salim. Do you guys have questions for him? I have a question.
Sure.
How is it to work in a team remotely?
Ooh, it's hard. Yeah, we have, the four of us travel a lot as well. So not only are we a remote team, but we're a traveling team. So we have to make an extra effort to, get on the weekly calls. It's difficult. It actually takes a big effort to change our habits, and also to be able to catch ourselves in our own thinking that you're disconnected from your partners. You don't know what's going on all the time, and everybody feels isolated. So it's actually, I think the hardest part is the emotional aspect of it.
What craft are you mastering?
So I'm building on the Michel Thomas stuff. To be honest, like the Arch Linux thing is not always the easiest. But now I've reached a point in the learning curve where I'm starting to be able to truly build the OS in the way I need it.
How long did it take you?
I switched to Ubuntu about a year ago, and then I switched to Arch 2 or 3 months ago. Yeah, so it's been a while, but I give myself time. I make it baby steps.
So you're a techie.
Yes, and actually I used to be a PHP programmer, and I lost the will to live. And
I keep hearing that.
Yeah,
PHP.
and the next thing for me is to learn AngularJS, to learn a modern platform.
Anyone that knows AngularJS in the room?
Hey.
Any advice to give him? Where to start?
Write apps? Cool. Yeah, Christmas project.
Okay, there's a question there.
I had a question about how feasible it is what you're saying. So before you're able to, so the thing that you said that people borrow from one industry and then they bring in the next,
Mm-hmm.
I think it's completely true, because if you look in history, the biggest innovators, and we talked about this a bit, they came from a completely different background, and then they were, software engineers, and then somehow they got hired in a medical business, and they saw, oh my God, you can do this completely differently. But to be able to do that, you have to be an expert in one field and then start experimenting, or how do you see it happening? Is it more like a hazard? Is it something that you can plan for? So any thoughts on that, on the top of your head?
I don't think it's that hard. I think it's more taking an interest in a broad range of things. The Michel Thomas thing just came up really just out of interest. I didn't really think it was relevant at first. I guess he's an educator as well, but language instruction didn't seem terribly relevant. But then I started to realize that I could hook that into customer development teaching, give it a little experiment, then realize I need to learn from him a lot more.
Okay, and the question is, how good were you at customer development before you saw that, before you stumbled on
Yeah,
that?
so by that point I had been doing it for years and years. So so I could start to see the parallels. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a progression. You care about being really good at something, and then you start to get good at other tools, and then you start to see where your other broader insights can be brought into that.
Any more questions? There's one.
Right. Hi, my name is Alex. I have a question. You being a developer, so you talked about crafting and being very passionate about the quality of your product.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we all started like that, building products and trying to make them the best possible. But then the first problem appears, the first critical thing appears, and then you have to do a compromise, and then the next, and then the next, and then they become basically the norm, really. You can't. So my question is, do you have any kind of advice on how to deal with that, or have you struggled with that? Thanks.
So to be honest, my focus has been on being an educator now for 5 years, more or less, more than being a developer. But we still face the same things, right? Like you take on different projects, they have different constraints, and then you have to compromise. But I think the flip side of compromise is starting to understand the trade-offs, because you're always going to be making design decisions that involve trade-offs. And as a business, what I found is that it's useful for us to start to take on some gigs, some contracts that have heavy constraints that we know are going to be quite awful to work on and are going to require a lot of late nights and so on. But in doing so, we're pushing ourselves in a direction to work out how to deal with that constraint. And then other times, we give ourselves projects that we either just run ourselves, or now, to be honest, we're quite lucky. We're starting to find organizations to work with that give us a lot of leeway. So in that case, we are certainly more in control of what we want to produce and how we produce it and so on. So, but there's a balance there. I think we tend to oscillate from one to the other. So I don't necessarily think, like it's the typical bad client. They're like, we need this now, and you're like, okay, well, I got to take shortcuts. Not all of that is so bad, because that's still part of the thing, right? It's like an actor saying, well, I don't care how the camera op does it, just get it done, right? Like once you become a director, you have to start to care about that aspect as well, and you actually care about managing the actors who are saying now what you used to say to the camera op, right? Like you start to care about the bigger picture and all the different skills that go into it. So yeah, and in the case of like a client that's, say, pushing you and causing you to make compromises, I would start to take interest in the client's world and start to see the thing as a bigger project. Because in the end, you're still trying to achieve the same outcome together. You just have the different focus, right?
Thank you, Salim.
Cool. Thanks.
Thank you very much.